August 6, 1945. The day warfare changes irreversibly. It is not the result of a battleship or a fighter plane. Instead, it comes from a device less than 10 feet in length and 3 feet in width. Dropped from a B-29 Superfortress, the bomb known as Little Boy is the first atomic weapon to be used in history. Alongside its accomplice, Fat Man, these two weapons of mass destruction pulverize the Japanese, as two cities are obliterated. Now, the world led by the United States and the Soviet Union enter a new and frightening age where just one bomb can wipe out an entire population. With the Second World War ending and the Cold War beginning, America and the Communists start a massive buildup of this new technology. The race is on, where whoever possesses the most deadly arsenal of atomic force prevails. On both sides of the Iron Curtain, nuclear weapons become the ultimate symbol of strength and might. And during this period of intense Cold War anxiety, the idea of having aircraft fueled by this new source of energy is given the green light. If a nation can power homes and submarines with nuclear power, will planes be next? Having an atomic reactor on board has endless possibilities. Unlimited range, and the ability to be anywhere in the world in a matter of hours, ready to strike. Truly awesome aviation that will determine the #1 superpower. Unfortunately, this concept is easier said than done. Placing a nuclear device on an aircraft is both complicated and extremely dangerous. Can American scientists and aircraft designers overcome these obstacles? Can they prove the skeptics wrong? This is their story. The United States' decade-long saga to produce the first nuclear-powered aircraft. Prepare to experience the atomic-powered plane.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored.
With the Japanese surrender on the USS Missouri, Americans are both victorious and confident. The war they have been fighting for over 3 years has finally ended. They have emerged a superpower with what seems to be an unlimited industrial capacity. The nations of Europe are no longer the power brokers they once were, for it is the United States and its ally the Soviet Union that remain strong at the end of the Second World War. But just as this conflict ends, a new and more deadly struggle begins, as Nazism is replaced by communism as the greatest threat to Western democracies.
Nobody really knew a grand vision for Europe, even as Nazi Germany collapsed. There were still large questions as to territory, peoples, the movement of peoples, and exactly how this would all work out. The grand strategy with Franklin Roosevelt's the famous spheres of influence, which means nothing, everything and nothing at exactly the same time, and that's where the roots of the Cold War come in big. There was a lot of tension and a lot of questions on both sides as to how it would all work out.
With this shift in the balance of power, the Soviets are no longer America's ally. They are now the enemy. And for the next 50 years, tensions between the two superpowers are felt beyond the capitals of Moscow and Washington, D.C., as the world is divided between capitalist and communist. Whoever can win the hearts and minds of those around the globe will emerge victorious. As this new Cold War takes shape, people begin to realize that America's victory over Japan has become a double-edged sword. The dropping of an atomic bomb, the nuclear genie has been let out of the bottle.
Well, world reaction was stunned. I mean, this is, I think, even at the time and place, a realization that it was a monumental event. even though nobody really understood what had taken place scientifically or even politically, even with respect to the war, it was unclear. But I think most people understood, and my read of the press in particular at the time was an acknowledgement that this was really big. This wasn't just any sort of military adventure whatsoever. But it's important to keep in mind that almost nobody, including the men who made the decision to drop it and the scientists who worked on the project, understood its ramifications in full. And I think it's useful to remember Einstein, right, saying, I don't know how they're going to fight this war, but I guarantee you how they'll fight the next with sticks and stones.
Fearing the Soviets will be next, Russian scientists begin a mad rush to acquire this technology. What the United States possesses, they must equal and better it. It is unlike any other arms race in history. The end result could potentially wipe out 1/2 of the world's population, and even more. For this reason, it is vital that both nations attain as much nuclear technology as possible to deter the other from striking. As a result, rigorous testing is done on both the American mainland and on strategic outposts like Bikini Atoll.
The B-29 Dave's Dream takes off from Kwajalein to deliver the bomb, equal to 50,000 tons of TNT, while an electric metronome counts the final seconds. Cover your eyes. Now, on away!
To calm public fear of atomic power, every attempt is made by the United States government to emphasize the positive aspects of this new source of energy. Nuclear power plants are constructed across the country as a sign of progress and achievement. President Eisenhower goes to the United Nations with the idea of using atoms for peace.
The United States pledges before you, and therefore before the world, its determination to help solve the fearful atomic dilemma, to devote its entire heart and mind to find the way by which the miraculous inventiveness of man shall not be dedicated to his death, but consecrated to his life.
You have to understand the atomic aircraft project as part of the pentomic era. The 1950s, late 40s and early 50s, when everything that could be atomic was being turned into an atomic thing. There was atoms for peace. There was the idea that energy would be so cheap you couldn't meter it. You wouldn't have to meter it. Anything that could be powered by the atom was to be powered.
Despite these efforts, many are still skeptical about this source of power and its deadly ramifications. These fears are amplified with the development of Project Pluto, a nuclear-powered missile designed to unleash fission fragments all over the Soviet Union. Dubbed the Flying Crowbar, this weapon is considered too extreme even for the most hawkish Cold Warrior and is abruptly cancelled. Looking at the carnage of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, numerous Americans fear this technology throughout the 1950s.
What's it like, Chaplain? First of all, one sees a very, very bright light, followed by a shock wave, and then you hear the sound of the blast, and then it seems as though there's a minor earthquake. And then you look up and you see the fireball as it ascends up into the heavens. It contains all of the rich colors of the rainbow, and then as it rises up into the atmosphere, it turns a beautiful pale yellow, and then assembled into the mushroom. It's a wonderful sight to behold.
Hoping to end these concerns, in January of 1954, the USS Nautilus becomes the first naval vessel to safely enter the nuclear realm. With an atomic reactor powering the submarine, it can stay submerged for months if necessary, giving the United States a huge advantage over the Soviets in case trouble erupts. With this advancement, many are asking if it can work for an airplane as well.
And that's what, if somebody got the bad idea, Well, nuclear power, you can run a submarine, why can't you run an airplane?
Much will be learned here of the workings of atomic engine, not only for submarines, but for many peacetime uses as well. For passenger and merchant ships, for land transportation, for electric power plants, even perhaps for the huge airplanes of the future.
Submarines are not constrained by the same weight limitations as an airplane. So you could put a 10-ton reactor in with 100 tons of shielding, all wrapped around it in something that need only float. It's a completely different physics principle. And so therefore you have the space in the submarine for large reactors, large shielding, and large cooling systems.
It appears that what the Navy has been able to accomplish, the Air Force is going to have a harder time replicating. Despite all the doubts and skepticism, the decision to combine atomic energy with aviation is approved. Just like how the Liberators and flying fortresses that destroyed German cities mercilessly played an enormous part in winning the war in Europe, and how the constant bombardment of Japanese cities by B-29s was essential to American victory in the Pacific, perhaps a new bomber, powered by nuclear energy, will defeat the Soviets. For this reason, it comes as no surprise that many inside Air Force circles are eager to have a plane powered by the atom up in the skies as soon as possible. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States Navy hopes the same Anglo-American cooperation that produced the P-51 Mustang can result in their own version of a nuclear aircraft. Looking for the biggest plane Britannia can offer, both countries study the possibility of converting the gigantic Saunders-Roe Princess flying boat, a plane whose time has passed, into a device given its second wind by nuclear power. A key advantage of this concept is its range. Just 1 pound of uranium-235 is the equivalent of over 250,000 gallons of jet fuel.
With the end of World War II and the start of the Cold War, they now needed a bomber that could reach the Soviet Union from the United States. A nuclear-powered aircraft would not be limited by a fuel load, so it was desirable from that point of view.
With 30 million horsepower, theoretically, the aircraft could be up in the skies far longer than any conventional bomber in the US's arsenal.
Would sort of loiter over somewhere, US soil presumably, for days or weeks on end possibly, sort of simply be there as a warning.
So despite fears of nuclear annihilation, both the Air Force and the American government approved the project to develop this plane. In May of 1946, the Nuclear Energy for the Propulsion of Aircraft, or NEPA, is created, where in the secret atomic city of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the first stages of development begin. Looking for a company to start testing, Washington goes to one of its very best, Convair, makers of the massive B-36 Peacemaker. They are awarded the contract to begin designing their version of the atomic-powered plane, which after more than a decade of research and development, they dub the NX-2, an aircraft that looks eerily similar to North American Aviation's B-70 Valkyrie. The question is whether they'll use a B-36 or the new revolutionary jet-powered B-60 to begin their preliminary tests. An act of divine intervention makes this an easy decision for Convair when a tornado rips through Carswell Air Force Base, damaging a fleet of peacemakers. With little to lose, it is after this natural disaster when the choice is made to repair one of the B-36s, named the Crusader, and turn it into a nuclear-powered bomber under the Plan X6, with the General Electric Corporation chosen as the company to build its reactor.
The US Air Force had a nuclear reactor installed aboard a Convair B-36 bomber. The nuclear reactor did not fly the aircraft. It had its own engine that was simply there as an experiment to see, for example, the thickness of shielding required to protect the crew from long-term exposure to radiation.
A key roadblock in the plane's development comes from the radiation it will emit. Anyone standing within 100 feet of the core reactor unprotected is in store for a lethal dose of radioactivity. On land, nuclear power plants are shielded by more than 6 feet of concrete. In the skies, however, this shielding is too heavy for any aircraft, including the B-36, to sustain.
The single largest problem with an atomic-powered aircraft is that a reactor requires much shielding. Roughly for every ton of reactor, you require 10 tons of shielding. This was the case in the NV-36 program. A relatively small reactor required a cockpit shielded with 12 tons of lead and lead crystal glass just to protect the crew from the radiation emitted by the reactor.
And for it to be economically feasible, it must be able to carry a payload bigger than the B-52. For nuclear aviation to become reality, these barriers must be overcome by its designers. With this in mind, Convair's still unbuilt NX-2 places its pilots and crew far away from the reactor, hopes that less shielding will be required. But even if this is accomplished, there are still questions surrounding the heat generated on board the plane. Producing more radiation than a nuclear power plant into such a contained space has scientists worried that the intense temperatures are going to melt away the aircraft's interior.
There was no real way at the time to fix these problems, much as there isn't now. The shielding still grossly outweighs the reactor, and it turns out there's really no need for it.
Just like the Navy and its Princess flying boat, the Air Force is slowly realizing that the plane and the atom don't mix. Adding to these problems is many people's fear with all things nuclear. With the possibility of an entire city being wiped out with the flip of a switch, there are grave concerns over what happens if the plane crashes. If a hot reactor falls on a heavily populated area, the civilian casualties could be enormous. With this in mind, every precaution is taken when the NB-36 is sent out on a test flight.
We had a B-50 as a chase airplane to follow us in flight. Then they decided if we had to, for instance, an accident, what were we going to do? Well, they decided we better have some paratroopers to follow us down. We had C-19 to carry paratroopers. And we learned all of this was secret.
Eventually, for a number of reasons, safety, cost, practicality, the nuclear-powered aircraft never got off the ground.
With this concept all but dead, it is miraculously brought back to life when a report surfaces that the Soviets are building their own version of an atomic-powered plane, in the form of a modified Tupolev 95.
One of the big pushes for this project happened after the NB-36 had stopped flying. In December 1958, the very important magazine Aviation Week, now called Aviation Week in Space Technology, published an editorial with photographs that they said were of an atomic-powered aircraft being flown in the Soviet Union. They had these drawings that even showed the big red stars on the side of the aircraft. Turned out to be a complete falsehood, a complete lie, and it's now thought that it was put out by the contractors and the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, who were trying to push the atomic aircraft program through Congress and to force the U.S. Air Force to accept it.
Many of the cutbacks have not been justified. I would not want to condemn all. I know one which I regard as very damaging indeed, the cutback and the stretch out of the atomic airplane program. If our technicians were permitted the money and the authority to go ahead, they could fly an atom plane next year. Under the Take It Easy program of the administration, however, we are not scheduled to fly an atomic plane before 1964, if then. I doubt if the Russians will wait that long.
Afraid of another Sputnik, the American government assures its people that with each passing year, a nuclear-powered aircraft becomes more of a reality. While behind the scenes, its designers know the project is impossible to achieve. One major blow comes from President Eisenhower, who fights to end this plane before it consumes hundreds of millions of dollars more in appropriations. But perhaps the biggest nail in the NX-2's coffin comes from a Boeing -80 prototype.
In 1957, the last year that the NB-36 was flown, the U.S. Air Force introduced its first KC-135 tankers. 3 years later, they had 400 of these aircraft, servicing as airborne refueling stations for B-52s. They could now reach any part of the Soviet Union from the United States without landing. The idea that you now needed a reactor to do this was over, and the U.S. government realized the project was essentially dead because they already had the bomber force that they wanted. With KC-135s and B-52 Stratofortresses, by the end of the 1950s, patience is wearing thin for a nuclear-powered bomber. After spending more than $500 million, and with no end in sight, the project is now on the chopping block. As one politician is overheard saying, it has been marked by a lack of well-defined objectives and by administration indecision. The optimism of the late 1940s and early 1950s has vanished. And when a Defense Department official tells the media that the plane's price tag will be over $10 billion when finally completed, the NX-2's days are numbered.
The world is very different now.
In 1961, as the Eisenhower era ends and John F. Kennedy is sworn into office, the project receives its final nail in the coffin when the aircraft, like many other Cold War creations, is terminated.
At the end of the day, heavy atomic reactors don't really belong on aircraft, and aircraft with refueling can reach their targets anywhere in the world. A reactor was simply found unnecessary to do the job the U.S. Air Force wanted to do.
Like many other Cold War concoctions, the atomic-powered plane represented thinking big. During a time when many thought that nuclear energy was the future for transportation, it was almost inevitable that an endeavor of this magnitude would be undertaken. With America and the Soviets on the brink of complete annihilation, aircraft like these were given the go-ahead, despite its impossibilities. In the end, the atomic-powered aircraft became the quintessential example of a military-industrial complex run amok, where profits were placed above people, and where Convair was placed above common sense.
Summer 1945. The war in Europe is over. But the world is not yet at peace. In the east, Japan fights on. Her Imperial Navy is all but ruined. Her armies are destroyed or cut off on isolated islands. Her air forces are crippled by the loss of her experienced pilots. Japan's dream of empire is shattered, but her military leaders refuse to surrender. The battle for Okinawa ended in mid-June after 82 days of ferocious fighting. From there, the Allied forces of America and Britain planned to attack the home islands of Japan. But their victory on Okinawa had come at a terrible price. More than 50,000 Allied soldiers, sailors, and airmen were dead, wounded, or missing. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers were killed or committed suicide. And more than 100,000 Okinawan civilians, perhaps a third of the population, were dead, many of them by suicide. As Allied leaders prepared for a massive invasion of Japan's home islands, military leaders in Japan swore to fight to the very last man, woman, and child. In late July, United States President Harry Truman and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill made a fateful decision, one that they hoped would end the war as soon as possible and save both the Allies and the Japanese from the bloodbath of an invasion. On 6 August 1945, the Americans unleashed a weapon the likes of which had never been seen before, the atomic bomb. 6 years and $2 billion in the making, the atomic bomb would finally bring an end to the Second World War. Perhaps no mission has ever changed the course of war more definitively or abruptly than the one undertaken by the 509th Special Squadron of the U.S. Army Air Forces and the B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay. I'm Gary Sinise, and this is Missions That Changed the War. August 1945, 8:10 a.m. local time. 32,000 feet above the city of Hiroshima, Japan, a lone American B-29 bomber made its way toward a point over the city's center. Dutch Van Kirk was the navigator of that lone B-29. Today, he is the last surviving member of her 12-man crew.
To the day Paul Tibbets died, he and I would argue about whether or not I volunteered for this job. He'd say, well, when I called you, you volunteered. I'd say, yeah, when I got my damn orders, I noticed they're dated 2 days before your telephone call. So much for the volunteering part.
I was flying with the crew that, the captain in charge of that crew couldn't handle him. His name was Rocket. And nothing the matter with him, but he had two characters in his outfit he couldn't handle. One of them was Theodore J. Van Kirk, and the other was Thomas W. Farabee. And so I said, that's the crew I want. They'll do what I want them to do. Well, it worked out that way. Of course, that's the beginning of a long relationship between the two of us. We didn't fly together too much, but we knew where each other was and all that sort of thing. When I got the bomb project, of course, they were the first two people I asked for.
On that fateful morning in Hiroshima, Japanese authorities ignored that lone bomber. It was too high for fighters or anti-aircraft fire. And besides, a single enemy bomber was not much cause for concern. At precisely 8:15 and 17 seconds, Bombardier Tom Farabee released a single 5-ton object from the aircraft's bomb bay. Freed of its heavy load, the B-29 surged upward. Sergeant Wyatt Dusenberry, the flight engineer, pushed the throttles forward, and the pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets, banked the aircraft left into a gut-wrenching turn that would take it far away from the target as quickly as possible. It was an evasive maneuver the crew had practiced many times. The object fell for 43 seconds through the clear air toward its aiming point, the T-shaped Aioe Bridge. At 1,890 feet above the waking city of Hiroshima, the object, known to its builders as the Little Boy, erupted in an unimaginable burst of heat and light, a single weapon with the power of 13 to 18,000 tons of high-explosive TNT. In an instant, its 1,200-foot fireball reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Near ground zero, sand melted into glass, and every living thing was vaporized or turned instantly to carbon. A full mile from the center of the blast, the shockwave turned buildings into shrapnel. In the cockpit of the Enola Gay, 9 miles from the blast, it was as if 1,000 flashbulbs had popped off all at once. In the tail, Gunner Bob Karen winced in pain and tore off the special goggles issued to the crew. Even through the polarized welding glass lenses, he feared he had been struck blind by what he later described as the fire of 1,000 suns. Of all the Enola Gay's crew, Karen had the best view of the blast. To the rest of the crew, he described a roiling, fiery mushroom-shaped cloud that boiled up 30, 40, 50,000 feet. A moment later, the first shockwave from the blast hit the airplane, shaking the huge bomber like a leaf in a gale. The aircraft was shaken a second time as the shockwave rebounded off the earth below, but the Enola Gay held together. Deke Parsons, the Enola Gay's weaponeer and bomb commander, sent a coded message to Tinian. The mission was a success. Below, the city had vanished beneath a boiling pall of dirty brown smoke. Flames were erupting everywhere. Karen likened it to bubbling molasses or the fires of hell. Colonel Tibbets turned the plane broadside to the blast to give the crew a better view. While Karen wrestled with a bulky K-20 camera, the rest of the 12-man crew was mostly silent.
The first thing we saw was a mushroom-shaped cloud, so-called mushroom-shaped cloud. All different colors within the base of that cloud. And on top of it was a mushroom you could see. It was up well above our altitude already, I'd guess, 40,000 going higher. And then as we turned on around and everything, we could see the city of Hiroshima, and we could make absolutely no visual observation because the entire city was covered with thick black smoke and everything. You want the description of it? I say it looked like a pot of boiling oil down there.
As Tibbets turned the Enola Gay toward Tinian and home, many of the men on board shared a single thought. This could be the end of the war. As they headed back to their base at Tinian, 6 hours away in the Marianas Islands, the men aboard the Enola Gay were awestruck by what they had seen. They struggled to find the words to describe it. From the tail, Karen could see the mushroom cloud for more than an hour. Finally, 400 miles from Hiroshima, he reported to the rest of the crew that the cloud was no longer visible. As the plane flew southward across the featureless Pacific Ocean, conversation dwindled among the crew as the excitement of the mission wore off.
We were also damn tired of coming back. It didn't make any difference what mood we were in, for crying out loud.
From Tinian, Captain Parsons' radio message was forwarded to the Pentagon. President Harry Truman was aboard the USS Augusta, returning from a meeting with Britain's Winston Churchill and Russia's Joseph Stalin. During lunch with a group of enlisted men, Truman was handed a copy of the message from Tinian. "This," he exclaimed, "is the greatest thing in history."
The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans.
Aboard the Enola Gay, the crew talked of the end of the war. Some speculated that it might be all over by the time they landed at Tinian. How could the Japanese fight on?
Everybody said they can not possibly stand up to force like this. In fact, Dick Nelson made it much simpler. He said, "This war is over."
The atomic bomb was an entirely new weapon, more complex, more sophisticated, and more deadly than any weapon system that had come before it. The airplane that delivered the atomic bomb was equally innovative, a technological marvel. At the time, it was the largest and most sophisticated aircraft ever flown. With its large bomb load and very long range, the B-29 was designed and built for just one purpose: to strike at the very heart of Imperial Japan. In 1939, with the threat of war gathering in Europe, the Army Air Corps requested design proposals for a very long-range super bomber.
Things looked so bad in Europe that it would look like Great Britain would be defeated and occupied by the Nazis. And the United States would have to bomb Europe from the United States. And so there came into being the idea of the intercontinental bomber. Now, it was ultimately realized in the B-36, but it set everybody's minds thinking.
Boeing Aircraft Company had a set of brilliant engineers.
They had done a whole series of design studies that led ultimately to the B-29. They incorporated in it so many things that would otherwise be regarded as too risky to involve into a single design to get the performance that they thought they would need. They incorporated pressurization in a bomber. They incorporated new engines, new propellers, new fire control systems, new metallurgy, new types of aluminum in it. Everything was pushed to an extreme. When it came into being, it had a very checkered career. There were constant problems with engine fires and so on. And yet, without a doubt, it was the most advanced bomber of the war. So it was the supreme bomber of World War II.
Boeing's B-17 bomber could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs and had a maximum range of 2,000 miles at a top speed below 300 miles per hour. For its new super bomber, the Army Air Corps specified a bomb load of 20,000 pounds, a top speed of 400 miles per hour, and a range of over 5,000 miles. The B-29 would be the largest and most complex aircraft of the Second World War. It would extend the range of strategic bombing over distances never before seen in combat. With its pressurized compartments, automated gun controls, huge engines, and immense size and range, B-29 was, in its day, one of the most complicated pieces of movable machinery ever manufactured. And it was designed, built, tested, refined, and ready for combat in just 4 years. Building the B-29 was not a simple task. Thousands of subcontractors fed parts to the 5 main assembly plants, 2 in Washington State and 1 each in Georgia, Kansas, and Nebraska. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941 and brought the United States fully into World War II, the XB-29 prototypes were not yet completed. But the Army was already impressed with the design. 1 month after Pearl Harbor, the B-29 went into full production with an order for 500 aircraft. The prototypes had not yet been flown. In the first months of the war, it was clear to American military planners that no other bomber had the necessary range to strike decisively at the heart of Japan, and the Army pressured Boeing to complete the B-29s in record time. But the Air Corps requirements for the B-29 were challenging. Its design was highly advanced, and the aircraft was plagued with problems. Throughout the B-29's development, and for much of its service life, the most common source of problems was the engines. The Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclo was one of the most powerful radial engines ever built. With its 18 air-cooled turbocharged cylinders in 2 rows, this mammoth produced up to 3,700 horsepower. But it had problems. The rear cylinders tended to overheat and cause engine fires. The crankcase was made of high magnesium alloy. It burned so intensely that it could burn through the main wing spar in seconds, with predictable and catastrophic results. Once it was airborne, the B-29 could fly on just 2 of its 4 engines, but the failure of a single engine during takeoff could be disastrous, with a full combat load of bombs and fuel. Other problems included uneven distribution of the air-fuel mixture to the cylinders and the engine's tendency to eat its own valves. During World War II, Nearly all B-29s operated in the tropics, where high temperatures on the runway increased the risk of engine fires and reduced aircraft performance. Engineers at Boeing and Curtiss-Wright tried many fixes, but the B-29's engine problems continued until the introduction of the 28-cylinder Pratt Whitney R-4360, which came too late for World War II. During the war, mechanics in the field scrambled to keep up with the fixes ordered by the engineers, including replacing the 5 top cylinders on each engine every 25 hours of engine time and replacing each entire engine every 75 hours. It was hardly standard practice to put an airplane into production before its prototype had been built and flown. Through 1942 and 43, as bugs in the design were discovered and fixed, many changes were applied on the production line. The B-29 is just one example of progress being accelerated by the demands of war. By the end of 1943, production was in full swing, but there were so many changes that the B-29s coming off the production line were flown straight to modification depots for extensive refits. Bad weather and other delays meant that in early 1944, Boeing had built nearly 100 B-29s, but fewer than 15 were airworthy. General Hap Arnold, commander of the Air Corps, stepped in to tighten the screws, and by mid-April, 150 B-29s were ready for deployment.
At B-17, you always put your oxygen mask on. When you wore your oxygen mask continuously, if you moved around, you had to take a portable bottle with you, and it was cold, it was uncomfortable, it was noisy. I could give you a lot of things wrong with it.
Power settings had to be calculated precisely and frequently for best performance. Getting the right takeoff and landing speeds was especially critical based on weight, air temperature, and field elevation. But all the extra charts and arithmetic paid off in more speed and longer range. The most revolutionary feature of the B-29 was its Central Fire Control System, or CFCS. Each of the 4 gun turrets mounted 2 50 caliber machine guns. Each turret could be controlled by any one of 4 analog computers, 1 in the nose and 3 in the pressurized waist compartment. The 5th gunner, in the tail, could control his own pair of 50 caliber machine guns or the guns in the rear ventral turret. The crewman in the rear dorsal turret was the central fire control gunner, who assigned the turrets to each of the other gunners. The computer-controlled gun sight for each turret compensated for the B-29's speed, the target's speed and angle, temperature, humidity, and gravity. The analog gun sight computer was highly advanced for its time and gave B-29 gunners an effective kill range of 1,000 yards, twice the range of a manually aimed gun turret. Paul Warfield Tibbets, Jr., the man who would later become a U.S. Air Force and aviation icon as the commander of the first ever atomic bomb mission, was born in Quincy, Illinois on 23 February 1915. The family moved to Iowa in 1918, where Tibbets' father worked in his family's grocery business. When young Paul was 9, his father moved the family to Miami, Florida, and, with a partner, started a successful wholesale candy company. In the summer of 1927, Doug Davis, a barnstorming pilot, was under contract with the Curtiss Candy Company to fly over county fairs, horse races, and other public events and drop its new Baby Ruth candy bars from his airplane. In Miami, Davis came to see the elder Tibbets, who was the distributor for Curtiss Candies. Young Paul sat in on the meeting and was enthralled by the dashing pilot. Davis needed someone to ride along in his airplane and drop the candy. Young Paul volunteered. Reluctant at first, his father agreed.
He looked at my father and said, Mr. Tibbets, I have to have somebody fly with me in the front seat and throw these bars out. While I fly from the back seat, I'll throw them out there. And of course, I held my hand up right away. My father looked at me and he said, no, not you. And my dad's business partner said, Paul, let him go, for God's sake, let him go. And Doug Davis spoke up at the time. He said, Mr. Tibbets, he said, I'm married. I got a lovely wife and 2 lovely girls, daughters. And he said, I'm going out there fly this airplane just like it should be flown. And I'm not going to hurt myself, and I'm sure not going to hurt him. And my father relented and said, okay. And that was giving me my first ride, throwing candy bars out over Hialeah racetrack. Well, I'm fascinated by that machine. I'm telling you, there's nothing like it.
As they flew over the local racetrack just after the second race, Paul threw out handfuls of the sweets. The Baby Ruths landed on target, and as the crowd scrambled for the goodies, Davis made 2 more bomb runs over the track before heading downtown to the beach. They flew similar missions every day for a week before Davis moved on to another city. He later joined Eastern Airlines and became its most famous pilot, helping to pioneer air travel in the U.S. Young Paul Tibbets never forgot the excitement of those flights over Miami. In 1928, as young Tibbets prepared for 8th grade, his father sent him to Western Military Academy in Alton, Illinois, where he would spend the next 5 school years. At first, Tibbets rankled at the discipline of the academy, but eventually he chose to make the best of it. He became a good student and an average athlete. He had a few run-ins with the cadet commander over various infractions, but the fairness with which he was disciplined made a lasting impression, and it would influence his own style as a commander in World War II. In later life, he described his 5 years at the academy as distasteful, but he also believed that they were useful in preparing him for the challenges he would face as an adult. The summer before he started college, Tibbets hung around Miami's Opa-locka Airport, fueling planes and doing chores to earn money for flying lessons. He soloed that summer in a Taylor Cub after 6 hours of dual instruction. After 5 years of military school, Tibbets had trouble adjusting to the freewheeling college life, and he nearly flunked out of the University of Florida. As a pre-med student at the University of Cincinnati, he helped out in a local clinic and spent his free time flying for the fun of it. Tibbets found himself less and less enthusiastic about his chosen career in medicine and more excited about aviation. As Tibbets pondered his future in late 1936, Douglas Aircraft Company introduced the DC-3 airliner. Suddenly, commercial air travel went from daring to safe and reliable, and Tibbets found his calling. Lacking the funds for a commercial pilot's license, he applied to be a cadet in the Army Air Corps and was inducted in February 1937.
I said, Dad, I'm going to be leaving school. He tried to look at me, leaving school, what for? Well, I'm going down to San Antonio, become a flying cadet, and learn to fly airplanes in the Army Air Corps. He said, well, you're over 21, I guess that's all right. But he said, I want to remind you something. He said, going back for a long time, I've supported you pretty well. I bought your clothes and done everything for you, put shoes on your feet and all that. But he said, now that's finished. You're on your own.
The Army, he reasoned, would teach him to fly and launch him on a career as an airline pilot. It never occurred to him that he might fly in combat. At Randolph Field in Texas, he was determined not to wash out. His 5 years at Alton had taught him all about military discipline and spit and polish. If following the rules was the key to success, he would follow them to the letter, avoiding every temptation to slack off or show off. Tibbets finished basic training at the head of his class and received the Army Air Wings in February 1938. As a top graduate, he was given his choice of assignment: pursuit, as fighters were called then, or observation. There were no bomber pilots in the Air Corps in those days. On the advice of one of the tactical officers at Randolph, he chose observation. That would open the door to solo missions and multi-engine training. During advanced training at Fort Benning, Georgia, Tibbets met a pretty department store clerk named Lucy Wingate. They were married in June 1938. After completing his advanced multi-engine training, Tibbets stayed at Fort Benning, flying the Martin B-10 bomber, mostly towing gunnery targets. In early 1940, the Air Corps' 3rd Attack Group received the new Douglas 820 Havoc. To fly the high-performance attack bomber, the Army searched for pilots with 1,000 hours or more of multi-engine time. Tibbets' name was on that list. He was transferred to the group's base at Hunter Field near Savannah and assigned as engineering officer for the 90th Attack Squadron. In 1940, the focus was on Europe, not Japan and the Pacific. In occupied Europe, the Germans were building flak towers up to 100 feet high and mounting anti-aircraft guns on top of them. Pilots in the 3rd Attack Group learned to fly their A-20 Havocs at high speed in tight formations at 100 feet or less above the ground. That would allow them to fly below the German flak towers, hugging terrain to avoid enemy gunners and plane spotters. Tibbets enjoyed the challenge. It required steady nerves and precise flying skills. By 1941, it was becoming clear to many Americans that the war was coming. The U.S. was organizing its civil defense system for warning of air attacks. Tibbets' 90th Squadron was charged with putting the new system to the test. Their simulated low-level attacks on cities like Boston and New York showed that the system was woefully inadequate. Theoretically, Tibbets later wrote, he and his squadron destroyed most of the East Coast. Attacking coastal cities, roaring in on the wave tops in tight formation at 200 miles per hour, the A-20s would sometimes nudge each other, a wingtip denting a fuselage or propeller nibbling at an elevator. But there were no serious accidents, and the pilots of the 90th Squadron became experts at low-level tactics. Tibbets was on a return flight to the squadron's base at Savannah when he heard the news that the Japanese had attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Tibbets was selected for training in the new B-17 bomber, and the B-17s were slow in coming. He was temporarily assigned to form an anti-submarine patrol unit flying Douglas B-18 bombers. As American war production geared up, the big flying fortresses began to arrive, along with the crews that would fly them. The B-17 was the largest land plane of its day, and some people thought it was too big and too complex for regular Army Air Corps crews to handle. Tibbets was given command of the 40th Squadron of the 97th Heavy Bomb Group at MacDill Field in Tampa, Florida. It was his task to prepare his green B-17 air crews for combat. It was an exhausting job. Tibbets sometimes flew 18 hours a day checking out the new pilots. There was little time and few resources to turn the raw airmen into effective combat crews.
Now, the training was nothing. You just flew the airplane around. You'd take barrels out in the Gulf of Mexico and drop them into water, and they'd go fly around and shoot at them. That was our training. We had no gunnery training or anything. Most of the time we didn't have ammunition to train. When we got to England, we were the blind leading the blind. Believe me, we were.
Too soon, Tibbets' squadron was ordered to the West Coast, bound for the Pacific.
We got orders to go to Fresno, California. Now, the group commander was not with me, but he got on the telephone. He called me. He said, Paul, you're going to get orders to go to Fresno, California. I am in Pennsylvania here at Olmsted with the other two squadrons, which I knew. He said, I will get the message. I will send one message to you about where to go, and I will join you later. I got my message. We got in the airplanes and we started for Fresno, California.
During their few weeks in Fresno, California, Tibbets drilled his men constantly in formation flying, navigation, and other critical skills. But when their orders came, the 97th Bomb Group was sent back across the country to Bangor, Maine. In early June, they were finally ordered to England. On 17 August 1942, Tibbets led 18 B-17s on the first daylight raid by American bombers on German-occupied Europe. Their target was the railroad marshalling yards at Rouen, France. Prior to that raid, British and American bombers had been striking German-occupied targets only at night. The Germans at Rouen were not expecting a daylight raid. Tibbets and his bombers caught them by surprise that day. About half the squadron's bombs hit their targets at Rouen. Their accuracy was less than was hoped for, but it was still much better than nighttime raids were achieving. 2 of Tibbets' bombers were damaged by flak. Their Spitfire escorts drove off 3 German fighters. All the bombers returned safely to England. The only injuries were caused by a pigeon that smashed through the nose of one plane, pelting the bombardier and navigator with shards of plexiglass. In October, Tibbets led B-17s and B-24s to Lille, France. It was the first time more than 100 bombers were joined in a single raid. Dutch Van Kirk, who would become Tibbets' navigator, entered the Army Air Corps cadet program in October 1941 and earned his navigator's wings 6 months later at Kelly Field in Texas.
After about a week there, maybe 2 weeks, they called out a bunch of names of 30 people, and they got us together and they said, "You people are going through here in half the normal time." Well, they forgot to and doubled up on the calisthenics as well as the classes and everything else. They almost killed us, for heaven's sakes. So we finally convinced them they only needed the regular calisthenics, but we went through in double time and we almost all went to the 97th Bomb Group over there. My first combat mission, we didn't get any enemy action. So I come back and I thought, oh, this is a snap, no touching to it. And I think it was maybe the 3rd or 4th mission that I changed my mind. I've been looking out the window on the right-hand side. We had 2 guns up there, one out the right, one out the left, and a 30 caliber out the nose. And we never hit a damn thing, but that's okay. I was looking out the window on the right-hand side. I turned around and looked back a little bit, look out the window on the left-hand side. The time I turned around and looked back out the window on the right-hand side, there were 4 bullet holes where my head had been. And I decided, they're shooting at me. I earned my money today. So from that on, we knew we were in a war.
That October, Tibbets, now a lieutenant colonel, was given the job of flying General Mark Clark from England to Algeria to meet with French commanders prior to Operation Torch, the American invasion of North Africa. Tibbets stayed in North Africa flying bombing missions when it moved to Algiers. In January of 1943, he became Chief of Bomber Operations for General Jimmy Doolittle, who commanded the 12th Air Force in Africa. Less than a month later, General Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, asked Doolittle to send back to the States his best field grade officer with the most experience in B-17s. The Air Forces had a problem, and Paul Tibbets was just the man to fix it. Arriving in Washington in late February 1943, Tibbets learned that the Army Air Force's newest bomber, the B-29, was in serious trouble. The aircraft was plagued with problems, mostly related to the newly developed Wright R-3350 engines. In July, Tibbets was sent to New Mexico to test the B-29 bomber's combat characteristics, with P-47 fighters making simulated attacks. The big bomber was hard to control in the thin air at high altitudes. it would be impossible to fly in tight combat box formations. Tibbets began to doubt the airplane's ability to survive in combat. On a day when his regular test plane was out of service, he borrowed a stripped-down B-29. Without its 7,000 pounds of guns and ammunition, the plane flew higher and faster and was much easier to control. Above 30,000 feet, the lightened B-29 could turn tighter than a P-47 and could outrun the fighters. It was an important lesson that he would later put to good use. In September 1944, Tibbets was called to Colorado Springs to organize and train a bomber group for a super-secret mission, one that might end the war. The Manhattan Project, America's program to develop an atomic bomb, was far enough along that figuring out how to deliver the weapon and training the crews to do it had become an urgent concern. The Army Air Force did not want a suicide mission. Tibbets' job was to figure out how to deliver the bomb safely and to assemble a bomb group specially trained to drop the weapon. He was to prepare 2 special bomber squadrons, one for Japan and one for Germany. Tibbets would get whatever men and resources he needed. If anyone refused, the code word silver plate would breach all barriers. As his base, Tibbets chose Wendover Field in Utah. The facilities were adequate and very isolated. USO comedian Bob Hope called it Leftover Field. The men called it the end of nowhere. As the core of his 509th Composite Group, Tibbets chose the 393rd Bomber Squadron, a combat-ready B-29 unit. And he began bringing in the best crewmen from his B-17 days. Bombardier Tom Farabee, navigator Dutch Van Kirk, flight engineer Wyatt Dusenberry, and tail gunner Bob Karen. These men formed Tibbets' own B-29 crew and helped to train the other crews.
It really came home to me when you saw, when they were describing what you were going to do, that you were going to do something that would destroy an entire city. It could be you're going to shorten the war or end the war. And you saw a bunch of guys running around who you knew were nuclear physicists. How many people in the organization knew enough about atomic energy at that time to guess that we were working on an atomic bomb is beyond me.
Security was extremely tight. Only Tibbets knew the unit's true purpose, and the men were cautioned, don't talk to anyone, and don't even be curious.
You didn't talk about it, because if you did, you would get sent up the illusions. There's no place like that.
How does one drop an atomic bomb and get away safely?
The scientists came to us and right at the beginning, and one of them said, "We think you will be okay if you're 9 miles away when the bomb explodes." I can remember looking at the guy and saying, "What the hell do you mean you think?" We could be wrong. Some guys are saying it could be 50 miles away. Some people are saying you can't get far enough away.
The bomb would be released from 6 miles high. A steep turn of 155 degrees and a shallow dive for speed would put the plane about 9 miles away from the explosion.
Immediately we decided we wanted to use stripped-down B-29s. These were B-29s that had all the turrets taken out, all the guns taken out except the tail guns, as much of the weight as we could get out of that B-29, take it out and get rid of it, so it could get up higher and go faster. We could not have done this mission in a regular B-29.
With stripped-down B-29s, the crews dropped dummy bombs and practiced navigation and the evasion maneuver that Tibbets had worked out. Germany surrendered on 8 May 1945. The 509th Composite Group now had only one target: Japan. They were ready, but at Los Alamos, the scientists argued about the odds. A 1 in 10,000 chance that the bomb's trigger would fail. They wanted 1 in a million. Tibbets said he would take 10,000 to 1 any day and he gave the order to move the bombers to Tinian, 1,500 miles from Japan. The pieces were in place for a mission that might end the war.
Most people have no concept of why we dropped the bombs at the time we did. They just assume that we dropped the bombs in order to cause those large casualties. They do not take time to read it and understand it. And no matter what you tell them, I don't think most people will never understand it. You go to high schools today, and the high schools today don't understand anything about World War II. I think I did describe how I was introduced at one's high school as a veteran of World War XI.
There had been no other mission like it in history. The use of an atomic bomb for strategic purposes in time of war. The complexity and destructive power of the weapon is well documented. That the little boy dropped on Hiroshima and the fat man dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later caused the Japanese leadership to change its policy of defending the home islands to the last man, woman, and child to one of immediate surrender is a matter of historical fact. It is a singular story of technological genius and the fog of war, magnificent courage and terrible suffering, diligent planning and unpredictable happenstance. The mission of the B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay and its crew on August 6, 1945, not only changed the Second World War, it changed the face of warfare as we know it until this day. It was, in fact, a mission that changed human history. I'm Gary Sinise, and this is Missions That Changed the War. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the airplane that dropped the atomic bomb, was as much a technological marvel as the bomb itself. It featured innovations like a pressurized cabin, an electronic fire control system, and remote-controlled gun turrets. Its wingspan, 141 feet, was nearly twice the span of Boeing's B-17 Flying Fortress. At 155,000 pounds combat weight, the B-29 was one of the largest aircraft to serve in World War II. It went from drawing board to combat in less than 4 years. It went into full production before its prototype flew, and the first B-29s to come off the assembly line were full of problems. But eventually, it became a very capable strategic bomber, and it served the U.S. Air Force through the end of the 1950s. In late 1944, the United States was well on the way to developing an atomic bomb. The U.S. Army Air Forces created a special B-29 bomber group to deliver the bomb. The 509th Composite Group. Its leader was Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets, one of the 8th Air Force's most experienced B-17 pilots and a test pilot for the B-29 program. Tibbets was tasked with organizing and training 2 special bomb units, one for Germany and one for Japan. As the core of his 509th Composite Group, he chose the 393rd Bomber Squadron, a combat-ready unit of 15 B-29s. In an archival interview, Paul Tibbets talked about the mission.
You got a tremendous amount of responsibility there. You got a tremendous amount of authority. Be careful of how you use it. We're in General Ent's office, and he is instructing me as to my assignment. You are going to organize and train a unit to drop these atomic bombs simultaneously in both Europe and Japan. And he told me about using my code word of silverplate, but he said General Arnold had advised his entire staff in Washington that any requisition with the word silverplate would be honored without question. I reflected back over the things that had been said, knowing that it was going to be the most important thing that I ever did in my life.
He added 3 more factory-fresh B-29s to the group, personally selecting his own aircraft from Boeing's production line. One of his main concerns was how to drop an atomic bomb and get away safely. The bomb would be dropped from 30,000 feet and it would explode 43 seconds later. Tibbets worked out an evasive maneuver that would get his bomber 9 miles from the blast.
The scientists came to us and right at the beginning, and one of them said, "We think you will be okay if you're 9 miles away when the bomb explodes." I can remember looking at the guy and saying, "What the hell do you mean you think?" We could be wrong. Some guys are saying it could be 50 miles away. Some people are saying you can't get far enough away. So you just paid your money, you took your choice.
The 509th trained at an isolated airfield at Wendover, Utah. Their mission was super secret. Only Tibbets and a handful of officers knew what they were training for, though others may have guessed.
We had every telephone coming into Wendover, Utah, or going out, it was tapped. Security was the most important thing that we had to maintain, because they didn't want anything to get out.
Tibbets cautioned the men of the 509th not to talk to anyone about the unit and not to speculate about its purpose. Violators quickly found themselves transferred to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, where they could talk as much as they liked to the walruses and seagulls. The air crews practiced navigation and dropped practice bombs called pumpkins that were shaped like the bulbous atomic bomb but filled with conventional high explosives. For maximum altitude and speed, they stripped their B-29s, dumping 7,000 pounds of gun turrets, ammunition, and other gear. Their only remaining armaments were their tail guns. By April 1945, it was clear that the war in Europe was in its final days. The bombers of the 509th now had just one target: Japan. In early May, they began shipping out to Tinian, an island in the Marianas Group, 1,200 miles from the Japanese homeland. Tinian is a 39-square-mile coral island, roughly 5 by 13 miles, in the northern Marianas island chain, 3,700 miles from Hawaii. Claimed by Japan after World War I, it was mainly a sugar plantation under Japanese rule. During World War II, the Japanese built 2 small airfields and launched fighters and light bombers from the island. U.S. Marines invaded the island in July 1944 and secured it on August 1st. 8,000 Japanese soldiers died in the 9-day battle. The Marines lost 328 dead and 1,500 wounded. Several hundred Japanese soldiers remained hidden in Tinian's semi-tropical jungles. The last survivor was captured in 1953. With Tinian secured, 15,000 Seabees moved in to build runways and prepare camps for 50,000 personnel. They built 2 airfields for the B-29s, a total of 6 8,500-foot runways, said to be the longest runways in the world at the time. Tinian became the busiest military airfield in the war. Massed bombing raids from Tinian began in November 1944. On the night of 10 March 1945, 279 B-29s, flying below 6,000 feet, dropped 1,700 tons of bombs on Japan's capital city, Tokyo. The bombs ignited a firestorm that destroyed 16 square miles of the city and killed at least 100,000 Japanese. 14 B-29s were lost. These massed raids continued until the end of the war. On Tinian, the 509th was again shrouded in secrecy. While other B-29 units flew low-level airstrikes on Japan, from which some crews did not return, the planes of the 509th flew milk runs, dropping their pumpkin-shaped bombs from high altitude, far out of reach of enemy fighters and flak. Other units began to view Tibbets' crews as pampered misfits who contributed nothing to the war effort. When word slipped out that the group's mission might end the fighting, someone wrote a satirical song called "The 509th is Winning the War." In truth, the group's station on Tinian was not hardship duty. The hours were long and the work was hard, but there were white coral beaches and a hospital full of pretty nurses to provide recreation. In mid-July, the 509th began flying missions to Japan, dropping their pumpkin bombs on military and industrial targets. In contrast to the huge low-level raids, the 509th sent only 2 or 3 bombers at a time over Japan and bombed in daylight from high altitude, around 30,000 feet. The Japanese began to ignore these daytime attacks. After all, 2 or 3 bombs did little damage compared to the massive nighttime raids. On 17 July, Tibbets received a coded message from General Groves, head of the Manhattan Project. The atom bomb test had been successful. Scientists had set off the world's first atomic explosion at Alamogordo, New Mexico. Up to then, it had all been theories and high hopes. Now, the super weapon was a reality. From Tinian, Colonel Tibbets made 3 round trips to Washington between May and July to work out problems and to discuss target selection for the atom bomb. At first, the list of possible targets included the cities of Kyoto, Hiroshima, Yokohama, and Kokura. All of these cities were important industrial or military centers, and all had been spared from conventional bombing. Kyoto was taken off the list when Secretary of State Henry Stinson pointed out that it had great historic and religious significance to the Japanese.
Remember, up to this time, they had a target committee, and there were a lot of people picking out targets and everything else. These targets, which had never before been bombed by any other means. I knew the 5 of them beforehand, but I didn't know which one it would be. But we were all in favor of Hiroshima. That was where we could do the most good with 1 bomb that we were going to drop and everything else. That's because the Second Army was there. You probably don't realize it, but 25% of the people killed in Hiroshima were military people. And then you had materiel that was going over to Shikoku for the defense of Japan and everything else. You could probably do more good at bombing that than you could of any other city.
The 509th continued to fly practice missions to Japan, dropping their black powder bombs configured in shapes similar to the anticipated atomic bomb. In mid-July, Tibbets learned that the atomic mission might be given to a different B-29 unit. Colonel Butch Blanchard, the senior operations officer on Tinian, had argued that other B-29 crews were more experienced and more qualified. Tibbets countered that the 509th had been training specifically for the atomic bomb mission and were fully competent to fly it. He offered to take Blanchard on a practice mission to prove his point. With Blanchard in the jump seat, Tibbets flew to nearby Rota Island, still held by the Japanese. the Tibbets plane arrived at its target precisely on time and dropped its simulated atom bomb precisely on target. With the bomb away, Tibbets snapped the big bomber into the evasive maneuver his crews had practiced. Blanchard turned pale as the G-forces pinned him to his seat. He declared that he'd seen enough. The 509th would drop the atom bomb.
The B-29 was not supposed to hold together under that maneuver, we later found out. Make the turn when you're coming off is steep enough so your tail starts to stall. Then you know you have the turn steep enough. And just push the throttles forward, lose a couple thousand feet in the turn, and just run like hell.
In the second half of July, the 509th made a dozen conventional raids on Japanese cities, dropping the simulated atom bombs, bulbous, pumpkin-shaped casings filled with black powder or other conventional explosives. The raids avoided cities that were on the atom bomb target list. Their strange tactics, just 2 or 3 bombers at high altitude, confused the Japanese. Fighters almost never tried to intercept the bombers, and anti-aircraft fire couldn't reach the B-29s at 30,000 feet. Gradually, the Japanese became accustomed to seeing small groups of bombers that didn't cause much damage. Although some of the pumpkin-shaped bombs were aimed by radar onto cloud-covered targets, it was decided that the atomic bomb would only be dropped if the target were clearly visible to the bombardier. Colonel Tibbets was prohibited from flying these practice missions to Japan. General Curtis LeMay, who commanded all B-29 combat operations against Japan, declared that Tibbets was too valuable to the atom bomb mission and knew too much to risk falling into Japanese hands. The pumpkin raids proved to Tibbets that his crews were ready for the atom bomb mission. They could deliver the bomb precisely on time and precisely on target. The practice bombing missions also revealed a potentially serious problem in the bomb's design. The fuse that ignited the bombs was a radar-actuated proximity fuse that was supposed to detonate the bomb at 1,890 feet above the ground. But on 2 occasions, the fuse detonated its pumpkin bomb too soon. Once over Wendover and once over the Pacific, the bombs detonated just after leaving the bomb bay at 31,000 feet. The premature explosions did no damage to the planes, but they caused some serious worry among the crews. Tibbets made the last trip to Washington in mid-July. There, it was decided that everything would be ready by the first week of August. Tibbets flew back to Tinian to oversee the final preparations for the mission. On the morning of 26 July, the cruiser USS Indianapolis arrived at Tinian to deliver the firing mechanism and a small slug of uranium for the atomic bomb. The second slug of uranium was delivered by a B-29 from the United States. Halfway between Guam and the Leyte Gulf, in the early hours of July 30, the Indianapolis was hit by 2 Japanese torpedoes. Of the nearly 900 men who went into the water on July 30, only 317 were rescued. It was the worst sea disaster in the history of the U.S. Navy. Back on Tinian, the technicians continued to prepare what some were calling the device. Its final assembly would be done on the day before the mission.
We never called it an atomic bomb at all. How many people in the organization knew enough about atomic energy at that time to guess that we were working on an atomic bomb is beyond me. But if you guessed it, you didn't talk about it. Because if you did, you would get sent up the illusions. There's no place like that.
Fat Man, like the atomic bomb tested at Alamogordo, New Mexico in mid-July, was an implosion-type plutonium bomb. A sphere of shaped explosive charges surrounded a smaller sphere of radioactive plutonium. When the explosive charges detonated, the pressure of the explosion compressed the plutonium sphere to critical mass, setting off an uncontrolled atomic reaction. Fat Man would be the second atomic bomb used in combat. The bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima was of a different type than the one tested in New Mexico. This was a rifle-type bomb in which one slug of uranium would be fired into another. The pressure of their impact would push both slugs of uranium to critical mass and trigger the explosion. Little Boy was a simpler design, and the scientists considered it more reliable than the implosion-type Fat Man. But in fact, a rifle-type atomic bomb like Little Boy had never been tested. Its first use as a weapon would also be its first trial run. America, China, and Britain sent the so-called Potsdam Proclamation to Japan on 26 July. Surrender, it said, or face prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese ignored it. Three days later, General Carl Toohey Spatz arrived on Tinian to take command of the U.S. strategic forces in the Pacific. He brought with him a signed order from General Leslie Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project. The order authorized the 509th Composite Group to, quote, deliver its first special bomb as soon as weather will permit visual bombing after about 3 August 1945, unquote. The target was to be one of 4 cities: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, or Nagasaki. Paul Tibbets favored Hiroshima. In a handwritten note on the margin of the order, President Truman wrote, quote, release when ready, but not sooner than August 2, unquote. Truman was meeting in Potsdam, Germany with Allied leaders Churchill and Stalin in early August and did not want the bomb dropped until that meeting was over.
I was never challenged. Nobody ever asked me, can I drop the bomb? Or, have you made a decision who's going to drop it? If they had, I'd have told them yes. Decision was made the first day I heard about it, and that's going to be me.
Colonel Paul Tibbets would fly the first atomic bomb mission with a hand-picked crew. Captain Bob Lewis, age 25, from Richfield Park, New Jersey, would be Tibbets' co-pilot. Lewis had often commanded the aircraft when Tibbets was busy with other duties. Theodore Dutch Van Kirk, navigator, age 24, from Northumberland, Pennsylvania, and Major Tom Farabee, bombardier, age 24, from Mocksville, North Carolina. Both men had been part of Tibbets' regular B-17 flight crew in England.
Tom Farabee was the best poker player I ever saw in the Army. And that's saying a lot. Best crap shooter, too. We met in the nose of a B-17. We were best friends until he died.
Captain William Deke Parsons, age 44, from Chicago, was a U.S. Navy ordnance expert who had worked on the Manhattan Project. He would be responsible for arming and monitoring the atomic bomb during the flight to Japan. He was assisted by Lieutenant Morris R. Jepson, 23, of Logan, Utah. Tech Sergeant Wyatt Dusenberry was the Enola Gay's flight engineer. He had flown in B-17s with Tibbets.
Dusenberry could really get more out of engines than anybody else. He was a master at engines and that sort of thing. And best flight engineer I ever saw.
Lieutenant Jacob Besser, 24, of Baltimore, Maryland, was a radar specialist.
These bombs operated on radar proximity fuses. They had to very accurately measure the height above the ground to get their explosion. If the Japanese had gotten onto the frequency on which they had operated, they could have exploded the bombs in the airplane. But we didn't think that was a very good idea. So we took Jake along and Jake was our radar countermeasures expert.
Filling out the Enola Gay's 12-man crew were PFC Robert Chamard, Assistant Flight Engineer, Sergeant Joe Staborik, Radar Operator, PFC Richard Nelson, Radio Operator, and Tech Sergeant Bob Karen, Tail Gunner. During the first few days of August, Tibbets gave considerable thought to a name for his airplane. He had no doubt that the first atomic bomber would become a celebrity of sorts, and the current identifier, plane number 82, didn't sound very heroic. He finally decided to name the plane after his mother, Enola Gay Tibbets. She was a strong, caring woman who had much influence on Tibbets' life and values. Bombardier Tom Farabee and navigator Dutch Van Kirk both knew Tibbets' mother and both heartily agreed with his choice. On the 3rd of August, the final order came from General Curtis LeMay, who commanded all B-29 operations in the Pacific. The official order for Special Bombing Mission Number 13 listed Hiroshima as the primary target, followed by Kokura and Nagasaki. If the number 13 worried any of the crew, they never mentioned it. Over the next few days, Tibbets and Farabee pored over huge aerial photographs of the 3 targets, especially Hiroshima. Farabee chose a landmark east of the city as his initial point where he would begin his bomb run. For the aiming point, he chose a bridge in the center of Hiroshima. Of the many bridges across the Ota River, the T-shaped Aioi Bridge would be the easiest to spot from 31,000 feet above the city. With orders to drop the atomic bomb only if the target were visible, Tibbets wanted to be sure of the weather over each city. Not content to rely on long-distance weather forecasts, he decided to send 3 B-29s ahead as weather reconnaissance planes. The planes would leave Tinian about an hour before the Enola Gay. They would fly over the primary target and the 2 alternates and report on weather conditions. 3 other B-29s would leave Tinian with the Enola Gay. One carried scientific instruments to measure the intensity of the atomic explosion. Another carried cameras to photograph the mission and the blast. The 3rd B-29 was a backup plane. It would follow the Enola Gay to Iwo Jima, about halfway to Japan. There, it would land and wait. If the Enola Gay had mechanical problems on the way to Japan, Tibbets would return to Iwo Jima, transfer his crew and the atomic bomb to the backup B-29, and complete the mission. On the morning of the 5th of August 1945, the forecasters said the weather looked good for a mission the next day. Final preparations went into high gear. The Enola Gay was moved to a loading pit while the bomber crew attended a mission briefing. By noon, the atomic bomb was loaded in the B-29's specially modified bomb bay.
And then they told us to go get some sleep. How they expected to tell you you're going to go out and drop the first atomic bomb, which might blow up the airplane, and go get some sleep is absolutely beyond me. I know Tibbets didn't sleep, I knew Farabee didn't sleep, because we were all 3 in the same poker game. And I don't even know who won. It was that bad.
The crews of the 3 strike planes were summoned again about 11 p.m.
They came and got us, final briefing, latest weather information, all that sort of stuff, air-sea rescue, everything of that type. And then over to the final breakfast. And I remember vividly what we had for the final breakfast. Paul Tibbets loved pineapple fritters. I hated the damn things. We had pineapple fritters for breakfast that evening, I should say.
The Japanese were known to be torturing B-29 crewmen who had been shot down over Japan. As Tibbets left the mess hall, the flight surgeon handed him a small pillbox containing 12 cyanide capsules. Tibbets gave one of the capsules to Parsons, but kept the rest to be handed out only in an emergency. Paul Tibbets made it clear to the crew that if the plane were shot down, each man should decide on his own whether or not to commit suicide to avoid capture. The crew arrived at the flight line about 1:45 a.m. to find the Enola Gay bathed in floodlights. General Groves wanted the plane's departure from Tinian to be recorded on film.
We got in trucks, went down to the airplane, and I think when we all got down there, we were all surprised because the plane was lit up by keg lights. It was like a Hollywood premiere, for heaven's sakes. Dick Nelson, who comes from Southern California, said, looks more like a supermarket opening to me. Point I want to make, if all the interviewing is being done, all the pictures are being taken and everything of that type, were being done by the Manhattan Project. There was no media on the island at all.
The crew boarded the aircraft and went carefully through their checklists. No one wanted to make the mistake that would jeopardize the mission.
We were very heavily loaded on takeoff. We were about 250,000 max gross weight. Normal max gross weight of a B-129 over there. At that particular time, it was about 235,000.
At 2:45 a.m., Tibbets began his takeoff roll on Tinian's 8,000-foot runway. As the aircraft reached 140 knots, its normal takeoff speed, co-pilot Bob Lewis reached for the control yoke.
I was confident that this was the only way to do it so that I could control with the tail if I had to. So when I'm going down there and I kept it past that magic 140 that Lewis was used to, he started to grab the yoke and pull back on it. He said, lift it off. And I told him, I said, keep your goddamn hands off of that yoke. I'm flying this airplane.
And he was in charge, absolutely. That was Paul Tibbets on an airplane. I don't know what speed we came off on it, but I know we used every damn foot of that runway.
At 2-minute intervals, the camera plane and instrument plane took off behind Tibbets, followed by the backup B-29. Conventional bombs were usually armed on the ground, but if the Enola Gay were to crash on takeoff, Parsons worried that a fire could set off the atomic bomb's black powder trigger. As the Enola Gay reached its initial cruising altitude of 4,700 feet, Deke Parsons and Lieutenant Jepson climbed into the bomb bay to arm the atomic bomb. While Jepson held a flashlight, Parsons inserted a small slug of uranium and a small explosive charge that would fire one uranium slug into another and trigger the atomic explosion.
I was worried to beat hell. The fact that we had an atom bomb right behind me, didn't concern me a whole lot. The fact that Deke Parsons was back there in the bomb bay, fooling the black powder, that worried me, because I knew what black powder would do.
With the arming task completed, the crew relaxed. Many of them slept, making up for the sleepless days leading up to the mission. The 6-hour flight to Japan seemed routine and uncomplicated in spite of their unique payload.
Use celestial navigation to get up to Iwo Jima, and if you get lost between Iwo Jima and Japan, you are the lousiest navigator in the world. I'm sure there's some people who have done it already, but not many. Because you had a volcanic island sticking up above the ocean, and you could pick them up on radar and lead your way right in.
At 5:55 a.m. Tinian time, the crew sighted Iwo Jima, halfway to the target. The backup airplane, a B-29 named Top Secret, landed there. Tibbets circled the island once to allow the two other B-29s, Great Artiste and an unnamed number 91, to form up on Enola Gay, and the three planes headed for Japan, 3 hours away. At about 7:45 a.m. Tinian time, the Enola Gay climbed to 32,700 feet, her intended bombing altitude. Half an hour later, Tibbets received a coded message sent from Major Etherly, the pilot of Straight Flush, one of the B-29 weather reconnaissance planes. The weather over Hiroshima was suitable for a visual bomb strike. The other two weather planes also sent messages. The skies over Nagasaki were clear, but Kokura, was hidden under ground fog. The skies over all three cities were empty of other Allied aircraft. Orders kept them well clear of the possible targets. About 9 a.m. Tinian time, the city of Hiroshima came into view, its white buildings gleaming in the morning sun. Dutch Van Kirk's navigation was near perfect, and the Enola Gay reached the initial point almost precisely on time. Tibbets turned the plane left to a heading of 263 degrees to begin the 3-minute bomb run.
We made the turn to the west. We wanted a bomb on a heading of 270. I missed it. We got on a heading of 263, and we just went in and dropped the bomb. Bomb run was very long. We were having conversations while we were on a bomb run. And Tom Farabee turned around to me once and he said, "Christ, Dutch, if we'd have sat on a bomb run this long over Europe, we wouldn't be here." Well, I said, "Is it still on the target?" He says, "It's gone right down the track." He says, "Nothing I can do." You see, when the bombardier is making his bomb run, he's flying the airplane. It's on automatic pilot, everything of that type. And Tom was extremely good at it.
An hour earlier, the B-29 weather plane, straight flush, had set off air raid sirens in Hiroshima, but no fighters rose to attack it.
The Japanese had no defense against high-flying airplanes up until that time, and we were going to be as high as we could get. So we didn't expect any enemy action of any type on this particular mission, and we didn't get any.
10 miles out, Bombardier Tom Farabee spotted his aiming point, the T-shaped AEOE bridge. At 90 seconds from bomb release, Tibbets switched the autopilot and gave the plane to Farabee. The city of Hiroshima was one of Japan's principal seaports. It was an important shipping point for soldiers and equipment. It was also one of the landing points for the Allied amphibious invasion that was planned for November 1945. It was the headquarters of the Imperial Second Army, the Chigoku Regional Army, and the Imperial Army Marines. There were large military supply depots and many small factories for military goods in this city of 420,000 people. The Enola Gay's pneumatic bomb bay doors opened automatically at 9:15 and 17 seconds Tinian time. The atomic bomb tumbled away. Its burden gone, the Enola Gay pitched sharply upward. Tibbets now had to fly the world's largest bomber as if it were a nimble fighter plane.
We made a right-hand turn, 60-degree bank, lost about 2,000 feet in the turn, pushed the throttles forward, just ran like hell.
Tail gunner Bob Karen felt like the last man in a wild game of crack the whip. Dutch Van Kirk recalls one particular thought as the plane sped away from the release site.
I hope it works. Because, it had never been dropped before. 2 days before, the fusing mechanism didn't work. I think if I'd have been a betting man, I would have bet before we dropped that bomb it was going to be a dud. So everybody was waiting to see whether it did explode and did it work. And then suddenly we saw the bright flash in the airplane. Hallelujah, it had worked. After we were certain we weren't going to get any more shock waves, we turned around to look at what had happened. The first thing we saw was a mushroom-shaped cloud, all different colors within the base of that cloud. And on top of it was a mushroom you could see. It was up well above our altitude already, I'd guess, 40,000 going higher. And then as we turned on around and everything, we could see the city of Hiroshima, and we could make absolutely no visual observation because the entire city was covered with thick black smoke and everything. You want the description of it? I say it looked like a pot of boiling oil down there.
The initial fireball incinerated or vaporized everything in the immediate area of the blast. Beyond that, buildings were flattened, then set on fire. 4 square miles of the central city were destroyed, about 60% of the city's area. The firestorm that erupted after the blast widened the destruction. Estimates put the human toll at 60 to 80,000 dead, and an equal number injured. In Tokyo, many in the civilian government argued for surrender. The Russians were poised to attack Manchuria. The Allied blockade was strangling Japan. There were food shortages. Victory was no longer possible. But Japan's military leaders vowed to continue the war. America, some said, had no more atomic bombs. On 9 August, a B-29 called Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, dropped an atomic bomb on Nagasaki. The mission was flawed. The bomb missed its target by nearly half a mile, causing less destruction than at Hiroshima. That same day, the Russians invaded Manchuria. 2 days later, a group of Japanese military commanders met in a plot to seize the government and continue the war. The plot failed when senior officers refused to join the coup d'etat. On 14 August, more than 1,000 American Army and Navy bombers hit Japanese cities. Faced with the total destruction of his nation, the emperor ordered the unconditional surrender of Japan. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki changed the nature of warfare forever. Atomic weapons elevated the role of the strategic bomber and helped give birth to the U.S. Air Force as a separate service. They shaped much of the military and political landscape of the second half of the 20th century. The decision to use atomic bombs on Japan, made jointly by Truman and Churchill, has remained controversial. But one fact cannot be disputed. The use of the bombs was intended first and foremost to end as quickly as possible a terrible war against a ruthless enemy who was determined never to surrender.
Let me say emphatically that there's no way in those days that I could have even considered not wanting to do it. I was anxious to do it. I wanted to do everything that I could to subdue Japan. And in other words, I wanted to kill the bastards. That was the attitude of the United States in those years.
The Battle of Okinawa in early 1945 produced 50,000 Allied casualties and up to 150,000 Japanese casualties. If Japan fought on, Allied leaders feared a score or more of Okinawas to be fought all over Asia.
If you were over there around Tinian, Saipan, Guam at that particular time, you knew that an invasion was going to have a lot of casualties because they were building hospitals all over those islands. We wanted a war to be over. We wanted to stop the killing.
The atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was instrumental in ending the Second World War. Tibbets, his crew, more than 1 million American servicemen and women, and the American public were overwhelmingly grateful for the peace that followed. And the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki has helped to ensure that such weapons have never again been used in anger.
I'd just like to say to all people that before you say anything critical about what we did and the casualties we caused, or anything of that type, study the history of the war, study the history of that people, find out what was really going on back in those days, and then make up your mind.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.